This is a Captain Adams VHS Pirate Ship special presentation. Edward Davis Wood Jr., better known to the world as simply Ed Wood. Filmmaker who's done basically everything there is to do in show business, but he would be renowned and revered as the worst director of all time. And it would be that title that would make him beloved to legions of fans and inspirational to many other filmmakers. And though his true fame and notoriety sadly would not be realized until after his death in 1978, his legacy left its mark upon the world. And boy, did it ever. I mean, come on, you don't achieve the title worst director of all time for nothing, and though true fame always eluded him while he was alive, he was no schlub and always kept busy. He was always involved in some sort of project and certainly wore many hats. Director, producer, actor, screenwriter, author, and for a time he was also a stuntman. Now, to talk about Ed Wood would mean starting at the beginning, which would mean starting in 1994, which I know makes no sense whatsoever, but hang on, because that would be the year of the release of the Tim Burton film Ed Wood, which would reintroduce Ed Wood to the world and make an entirely new generation aware of his work, giving it a second life, and Ed Wood would become a cult icon. Now, of course, Ed Wood was known before this movie was released, just not nearly as well, and he was in danger of being totally forgotten. But this movie would bring about a rediscovery of Ed Wood's endearingly bad work, and it made the world realize that Ed Wood should be better known than he was. This film would also prove to be beneficial to director Tim Burton. Though it didn't do too well at the box office, bringing in $13 million to counter an $18 million budget, it would, however, eventually become known as one of the best and most beloved Tim Burton films. This movie is regarded as a biopic, or biopic, however you want to say it, even though it's not really. You see, it's really just a treatment, loosely based on the book Nightmare of Ecstasy, The Life and Art of Edward D. Wood Jr. by Rudolph Gray. And while that book is a full-length biography, the film only focuses on the 5 most successful years of Ed Wood's career. And of course, that covers the span of the productions of Glen or Glenda, Bride of the Monster, and Plan 9 from Outer Space. Undoubtedly the 3 most famous Ed Wood films, and it's arguable, but it's because of the Tim Burton Ed Wood movie that is so. And it's certainly why these 3 films are unofficially regarded as the Ed Wood trilogy. But that title implies that he's only done these 3 films, and you don't need to do too much digging to realize that Ed Wood has done way more than that. He had a tremendously expansive career that went way beyond Plan 9 from Outer Space and even existed before Glen or Glenda. And how accurate is the Tim Burton movie anyway? Well, today we're going to examine that, and we're going to explore the career and filmography of Edward D. Wood Jr. And we're going to discover why he was such a daring filmmaker compared to his Hollywood peers, and why exactly it was that he would sign on to projects that anyone else in their right mind would say no to. Well, buckle up, because we're going to discover why they wouldn't, but Ed would. So, Tim Burton's Ed Wood is the main reason why some of us, if not most of us, even know who Ed Wood is. And keep in mind, I said some and most. I did not say all of us, so I do not want to hear, "Actually, I knew who Ed Wood was before this film was released." Yes, of course, I understand that is a possibility, but it is because of this film that Ed Wood was brought into the mainstream spotlight, perhaps more so than he had ever been before. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. How accurate is this film? Well, it is a movie, and if you're looking for historical accuracy, perhaps movies are not the best place to start. And this is no exception. There were liberties taken, and there is lots of embellishment to be found. Because it is a movie, it's supposed to be entertaining, and the truth, which sometimes can be stranger than fiction, is also sometimes just plain dull. And what actually happens in real life doesn't necessarily work well on film. That certainly is the case here, especially when it comes to Ed Wood's relationships and associations as depicted in this movie. For example, Ed Wood's association with George Weiss, producer of Glen or Glenda. In the Tim Burton movie, we see George Weiss portrayed by the great Mike Starr, and the movie depicts him as a tall, burly mountain of a man who you do not want to piss off, and of course, Ed Wood does.
Your movie? I wish it was your movie. I wish I hadn't blown every dime I ever made into making this stink bomb. And if I ever see you again, I'll kill you.
Hello?
But reality is a lot less interesting. The real-life George Weiss was small in stature and unassuming, and though he did take a financial bath when it came to Glen or Glenda, he certainly held no animosity towards Ed Wood. In fact, the two would eventually work together again, just not in the producer-director capacity. They would buy screenplay ideas and stock footage from one another throughout the course of their careers. The two kept in touch long after Glen or Glenda, and George Weiss certainly did not want to kill Ed Wood, as is depicted in the movie. In fact, in Rudolph Gray's book, George Weiss is quoted extensively and has nothing but good things to say about Ed Wood. Their association wasn't as tumultuous as the movie makes it seem. In fact, it wasn't tumultuous at all. But that's not really interesting, is it? It's just not as entertaining as it is portrayed in Tim Burton's movie. Another crucial Ed Wood association that's depicted in the film is the friendship between Ed Wood and Bela Lugosi. Apparently, that is rather accurate. The two not only had a great working relationship, but a great friendship as well. However, the depiction of Bela Lugosi, as portrayed by Martin Landau, is rather embellished. According to Bela Lugosi's son, Bela G. Lugosi, Bela Lugosi seldom, if ever, used profanity. And we see the exact opposite in the Tim Burton movie.
Fuck you!
All right, let's shoot this fucker.
Shit, where is my transfer? How dare that asshole bring up Carlo?
Fuck you, you come out here.
Well, no one gives two fucks for the baby.
Now, that's just according to his son. Maybe Bela did use profanity around his colleagues and not his son, but that's neither here nor there. Also, according to his son, Bela Lugosi never had small dogs, as he does in the movie. Which, honestly, I was a little bit disappointed to hear, but I guess it's not really that big of a deal. The drug rehabilitation that Bela went through, as depicted in Tim Burton's film, also went down quite differently, but in a very convoluted way, so I will not be getting into that for the sake of time. Besides, this is about Ed Wood and not Bela Lugosi. However, it is curious that you really can't talk about one without talking about the other. After all, Ed Wood did, to a certain extent, reinvigorate Bela's career. In real life, Lugosi and Wood were very important to each other and were rather good friends, but how did they meet anyway? Was it really a chance encounter in a coffin shop, as Tim Burton's movie tells us? Well, in a word, no. Apparently they had met through their mutual friend, screenwriter and producer Alex Gordon. And he was someone who was a rather pivotal figure in Ed Wood's career, yet somehow he was mysteriously left out of the Tim Burton movie. I'm guessing it just would have taken too much time to include another character in that movie, but Alex Gordon was pretty important. Not only did he help Ed Wood with the screenplays for Bride of the Monster and his later film, Jailbait, he also helped Ed get his foot in the door all over Hollywood. Okay, so evidently that last part didn't help him out too much, but still, he was a very important person to Ed Wood. So all in all, it really should come to a surprise to no one that the movie Ed Wood is filled with embellishments. It sums stuff up, it leaves stuff out, it changes some things entirely, and it certainly over-romanticizes the entire thing. The best example of this is at the end of the film, where we see that Plan 9 from Outer Space has a gala premiere. While it is great to see that, in reality, this never happened. The film did premiere March 15th, 1957 at the Carlton Theater in Los Angeles, California, but it certainly was not a gala event. And since it did not have a distributor, that's all the farther it went. Plus, it did not premiere as Plan 9 from Outer Space. Instead, it premiered under its original title, Grave Robbers from Outer Space. The name would not be changed until sometime after, and despite what we see in the Tim Burton movie, the Baptist had nothing to do with that. The name was changed to simply be more pleasing to distributors, which the film would eventually get, and it would be released nationwide in 1959. This is why, in Plan 9 from Outer Space, we see Criswell in his opening monologue refer to the film by its original title. The Tim Burton movie depicts this situation as an entertaining synopsis. And what we see, though it's entirely fictitious, is a lot more fun. But it's a movie. That's why we watch movies, to be entertained, to have fun, and not to be burdened with the truth. This film is fun. It's one of my favorites, but it does take a lot of liberties. However, there are some things that are rather accurate. The timeline of the production of the three featured films is pretty spot on. However, and though the movie never never states otherwise, we get the impression that Glen or Glenda is Ed Wood's first foray into filmmaking. But reality tells us that that's simply not true. Ed Wood had been working in film as early as 1948 with a project called The Streets of Laredo, wherein he was not only the director but also the screenwriter and an actor. This was a half-hour-long western that was shot on very poor quality film stock. And though this project took place in 1948, it was never completely produced or even released until 1995, where the name was changed to The Crossroads of Laredo, and this posthumous release was in no doubt due to the rediscovery of Ed Wood because of Tim Burton's movie. Now, I'm sure you could argue that, but that just makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? In 1950, Ed Wood would serve to be a stuntman in the Vincent Price film The Baron of Arizona. Though I should say stunt person because he portrays a woman, which I'm sure he was quite comfortable with. In 1951, he worked on a short film called The Sun Was Setting, but it was also called The Sun Also Sets, wherein not only was he the director, but also co-producer, screenwriter, and even did the music. In 1952, he would direct a trick shooting documentary that was sponsored by Remington Firearms. He would also be associate producer and plot consultant on a western called The Lawless Rider. And though the production had been completed, this would not be released until 1954. He would also work as a screenwriter on a now-lost western television show called Double Noose. In 1953, Ed Wood would of course get his big break with Glen or Glenda, but there was also other projects he was working on. He would be a screenwriter for a western movie called Son of the Renegade. He also directed, produced, and acted in a pilot episode for an ill-fated television show called The Crossroads Avenger, The Adventures of the Tucson Kid. And though this never got off the ground, he would try again with a very similar concept and renamed it Boots, and it still didn't work. At this point in time, the filmmaking bug had sunk its stinger in deep to Ed Wood, and in 1954 he released Jailbait, where he was the director, co-producer, and screenwriter. And it should be noted that this film's title is very misleading because it's not about what you think it's about. The original title was going to be The Hidden Face, which is what it should be called because that's what it is about. This film is a crime drama that's sort of like Face Off, without really being like Face Off at all. It's Face Off decades and decades before Face Off, but again, not really being like Face Off. With Jailbait, they wanted to go with a more provocative title, no matter how inaccurate and misleading it is. 1955 would see the release of The Bride of the Monster, in which he was a director, producer, and screenwriter for. And in 1956, he would be the screenwriter for The Violent Years, which he went uncredited for, even though this turned out to be Ed Wood's most financially successful film. 1957 would see the release of Plan 9 from Outer Space, in which he was director, producer, and screenwriter for. Also in 1957, he would play the same role for a project called Final Curtain, which was an unsold television pilot episode that obviously went nowhere, and footage from this would be later used in Ed Wood's 1959 film Night of the Ghouls, which wasn't released until 1984. Yes, some of the stuff does get rather confusing, so please just hang in there. 1957 was a busy year for Ed Wood because he was also director, producer, and screenwriter for a short film called The Night the Banshee Cried, and he had hoped to sell this to television stations, but it went nowhere because nobody wanted it. And this has long since become a lost film. In 1958, he would be a screenwriter for the film The Bride and the Beast, which is about a woman who falls in love with a gorilla. I'm not sure how you follow that one up, but in 1958, he was also a consultant for the film The Astounding She-Monster. 1959 would see the release of Revenge of the Virgins, in which Ed Wood was a screenwriter for. Also in 59, he wrote and directed Night of the Ghouls, but like I said earlier, that wasn't released until 84. The story goes, this was never released in 59 because Ed Wood simply owed too much money. In 84, Ed Wood mega fan Wade Williams located the film, paid the overdue bills, and bought the film outright. And he unleashed it onto the world, which in turn gave us the first VHS release of this film in the same year by home video distributor Nostalgia Merchant. In 1960, Ed Wood was director, co-producer, and screenwriter for The Sinister Urge, which incorporated footage from Ed Wood's unfinished 1956 film Hellborn, or Rock and Roll Hell. In 1961, he contributed to the screenplay of the film Anatomy of a Psycho, in which he went under the pen name Larry Lee. In 1962, he was co-screenwriter for the film Married Too Young, and in 1963, he would do the same thing for a movie called Shotgun Wedding. Ed Wood seemingly didn't do anything in 64, but 65 would see the release of Ed Wood's first plunge into erotica with Orgy of the Dead, where he was screenwriter and assistant director, and he wrote a paperback novelization of this film, which was published in '66. In 1967, Wood was a plot consultant for the film For Love and Money, which was an adaptation of his own novel, Sexecutives. He would then lay low in '68, but 1969 was pretty busy for him. He would act in and write the screenplay for Operation Red Light, a film that was based on another novel of his, Mama's Diaries, in which he wrote under the name Dick Trent. He would also be a screenwriter for the film Gunrunner and a screenwriter for the film 1 Million AC/DC, a movie that's about a bunch of horny cavemen. And then there's the film The Photographer, which has a lot of mystery surrounding it. Now, he did write the screenplay and act in it, but there are those who say that he also directed it. However, he went uncredited because this is his most humiliating role. I guess it's because he didn't want anyone to know that he directed himself to do this. But that's neither here nor there, and it's all hearsay, so let's just move on. As we turn the corner to 1970, we see the end of Ed Wood's career in sight. However, that does not mean he didn't do a lot of work. These last remaining years of his career were pretty busy. However, this is around the time when he started doing what was basically considered porn. Yes, from cheesy to sleazy, the last decade of Ed Wood's career, and also his life, would see him make the switch to doing mainly erotica films, basically because that's the only work he could get. Yes, he directed, wrote the screenplay for, and or acted in films such as Mrs. Stone's Thing, Excited, Take It Out and Trade, The Young Marrieds, Nymphocycler, The Only House in Town, Dropout Wife, The Undergraduate, The Cocktail Hostesses, The Class Reunion, Snow Bunnies, Beach Bunnies. Well, you get the idea. The last years of Ed Wood's life weren't all that pleasant, and it's an era that most people don't really like to focus on, because it is better to think of him as a mastermind behind campy monster movies instead of a sleazy screenwriter living in what was described as boozy poverty making bad porn. The epilogue of the Tim Burton Ed Wood movie does touch on this fate. However, it does describe it in a relatively rose-tinted way. Now, the 70s wouldn't see Ed Wood do all awful erotica. He would also do just some plain awful movies as well, or at least be associated with them in some form. There's The Venus Flytrap, also known as The Revenge of Dr. X, a sci-fi horror flick in which Ed Wood is an uncredited screenwriter because it's based on a screenplay that he wrote in 1950. And then there's Necromania, which is sort of porn, but it's more of a horror flick, which is based on Ed Wood's novel, The Only House. And oddly enough, Ed Wood's porno flick, The Only House in Town, isn't based on this. You'd think it would be. And then there's Hot Ice from 1978, where Ed Wood was assistant to the director and even had a cameo that was later cut because he was too drunk. And sadly, that would be his last film because he would pass away later on that same year. The 70s would also see some projects of Ed Wood's that would never come to fruition. Like in 1976, there was supposed to be a film called The Day the Mummies Danced, in which Ed Wood wrote the screenplay for. However, he could never find a producer. But in 1977, he would make his triumphant return, of sorts, to making straight-up horror movies with Meat Cleaver Massacre, in which he worked under the pseudonym of Evan Lee and replaced director Keith Burns. This film does feature Christopher Lee, however, it was footage from previously tagged projects that wasn't shot for this movie. As we know, Ed Wood passed away in 1978, but that doesn't mean his work stopped. Ed Wood would live on, and many of his unfinished projects would come to life. As I had mentioned earlier, 1984 would see the release of Night of the Ghouls, but the completion and release of Ed Wood's unfinished projects wouldn't stop there. The aforementioned Hellbound, aka Rock and Roll Hell, the film in which only 10 minutes were shot before producer George Weiss pulled the plug in 1956, would be eventually released in 1993. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, 1995 would see the release of Crossroads of Laredo, which was a completed and renamed version of Streets of Laredo. 98 would see the release of I Woke Up Early the Day I Died, which is based on an unproduced Ed Wood script from 1974. In 99, we would get the film Devil Girls, which is based on the 1967 Ed Wood novel of the same name. And in 2013, we would get The Vampire's Tomb, which is based on an unproduced Ed Wood screenplay from 1954. And if you remember, this idea is pitched in the Tim Burton Ed Wood movie, because when it comes down to it, Tim Burton's Ed Wood is a very beloved and inspirational movie, though the entertainment does outweigh the accuracy. Some things are true, some things are not. Like, yes, the cast of Plan 9 from Outer Space did get baptized, as per condition of that movie's financing. And yes, the Southern Baptist Convention Church of Beverly Hills, California, did fund that movie, though I wonder if they ever made their 12 Apostle movies. And yes, J. Edward Reynolds was the leader of that church, and actually Ed Wood's landlord, just as it's depicted in the Tim Burton movie, but no, that church had no problem at all with the title Grave Robbers from Outer Space. In fact, the real Reynolds is in Plan 9 from Outer Space as a gravedigger, and legend has it that that church even kept one of the original prints of the film as a souvenir. And there's other things, like yes, Ed Wood was a big Orson Welles fan, but no, the two had never met. At least, not in the fashion that's depicted in the Tim Burton film. And it should be noted that it is well within the realm of possibilities that these two did meet, there just isn't any record of it. Much like Bela Lugosi, to talk about Ed Wood is to also talk about Vampira, and her depiction in the Tim Burton film is fairly accurate. Yes, the two did meet at a party, and yes, she was very annoyed with him and less than impressed. But of course, the two would end up working together on Plan 9 from Outer Space, and yes, she did ride the crosstown bus to the studio in full makeup and costume, just like it's depicted in the Tim Burton film. But unlike the Tim Burton film, reality would see her play that part mute because she didn't like the dialogue, not because she didn't want to be noticed. So the Tim Burton Ed Wood film does have its fair share of embellishments, but truth and reality don't always work on film because sometimes they're just plain boring. And even though it's not very accurate, Tim Burton's Ed Wood is extremely entertaining. And Ed Wood himself, though his life was far from perfect and he had his demons, would become a legend. And though he would never see it in his lifetime, he would eventually achieve the fame that he craved so ravenously. Ed Wood knew exactly what he wanted to do and was very passionate about it. He gave the world some pretty crazy movies that are basically unwatchable but are also fun because of that. It was a burning desire to make films that no one else wanted to. He had no problem being daring or risque, and he was very different from any other filmmaker because they wouldn't, but Ed would. I know it sounds cheesy, but always remember to keep your dreams alive. Thank you very much for watching. Take care out there, and I'll see you next time only on Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship.